It's good to see you, Bart.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be here. Really nice to be here.
Tell me, had you ever heard of rugby before you arrived at Fairfield?
I had never. I played a little high school football, and I never heard of rugby until I came to Fairfield. And it just so happens that one of the guys on my floor, John Swanhouse, we were dorm mates at Loyola Hall, went out for the team, and was one of the originals, and that's how I heard about it.
And that got you hooked on it?
It did. I went down to see it. I didn't join until the spring of '64, which is the second season of the club, but it just became part of my life, and it's been part of my life ever since.
Talk about how the club got started, the early days. What was the model for the club's organization? Where did the leadership come from? How did you learn the game?
Well, the original group was founded by Doug Siassi and Pete Fallon, and Doug was a great high school football player. Fairfield had no football team, so he was looking for an outlet, didn't want to play soccer, and which wasn't that popular at the time anyway. So he got together with one of the professors, John Kenyon, who was Welsh, and they put the club together. Now, I don't know the exact workings of it, but they got the club together, and Kenyon was the first coach and faculty moderator. I wish we could find him today. Who knows where he is? Maybe up there. And that's how it got started. And then there was no model other than what Kenyon knew about rugby clubs that he helped transfer to Fairfield. But the first couple of years, we just kind of winged it. You know, I mean, I started going to practices. They were well organized. But after that, when I was a freshman and sophomore, I couldn't tell you how matches were scheduled or anything like that until I began to realize there was a match secretary and there was a treasurer and things like that. But in the first couple of years, it was pretty loosey-goosey. Rugby, it was all about playing the sport, and even practices were something you didn't want to miss because you weren't sure if you were going to be in the game that weekend.
Who did you play? Who were your tough opponents?
The first match I ever played that I really remember was a C-team game that I started playing against Manhattan Rugby Club. And I think the game was on the old Corbett Field. And Manhattan had never seen a field like this before because people don't know, but the old guys know, the thing sloped. And with a cast iron sewer cover somewhere out of the field. And
I remember.
And so we played that match that way. And of course, we changed sides at the half, so everybody had the advantage of going uphill or downhill. And that's the first game I remember.
Who were the club leaders, and why were they effective? They must have been great leaders. Why were they effective?
They were a really good bunch of athletes. Siassi was a great track star and football player. And then one of the people that took me under his wing was Al Sullivan. And Al was a New York kid from Long Island who was fast, really fast. And I think Al learned some of the game from Doug, but they played together. And I think Al must have been a really good high school halfback. But Al took me under his wing and he taught me. And Frank Quinn was on the team and he taught me a little bit. Jeff Campbell, guys like that. Kenyon would teach you. But it was generally other players that would teach the new guys as they came in. And that's how it got started.
Talk about some of the traditions that you saw developed or that evolved, and where they came from and how you learned about them.
Well, the sport itself, I just learned the rules from people like Kenyon, the moderator, and other guys. And then we would learn a lot from Eastern Rugby Union referees, guys that were from New Zealand, South Africa, England, great rugby countries that would referee the matches. And for the C-team players, they went out there with the idea that they would teach these guys how to play the sport so you could move up and get to the B team, and if you were good enough, get to the A team. And I remember a lot of that. I remember referees stopping games, my games, CT games, and say, hey, you did that wrong, here's how you do this. Because most of the time, we were playing other C teams, and they didn't know anything about it either. And so that happened. And then following the games, especially games in New York City, they have these great Irish pubs and places all over the city. Here I am, a kid from Kansas City, which is where my family was when I got admitted to Fairfield. And off I go into New York City, you know, thinking, oh my God, you know, I've struck the mother lode. And ended up in these pubs singing these songs and learning these traditions, and that's how I got into it.
So college is supposed to prepare you for life in the real world, and this obviously was one of the things you took from college into the real world. How did rugby help form you as a man?
That's a good question, and for me, I came out of a Jesuit high school education, so I understood something about the Jesuits. So transitioning to college from that point of view wasn't difficult for me. I always loved the Jesuits and was used to being around them and things like that. But as far as rugby goes, it was so much different than any high school football team or track team I was ever on, that the things I learned were the immense amount of teamwork and sportsmanship that is required on both sides to play the game effectively. It's something you didn't see in football, and I began to learn about that. Another thing I learned about was the fact there's no substitutions in rugby. You get smashed up, you get hurt, you get winded, you've got to keep going. And you've got to learn how to plow through objects and overcome obstacles and things like that. And if you get really hurt, you got to try and keep going because you can't let your teammates down. And those are kind of lessons that carried on for me in other parts of my life, to just deal with what's in front of you, keep going, do your best no matter what shape you're in or what the conditions are.
You were a president of the Fairfield Rugby Club in 1967, 66 and 67, and you were involved for 4 years. What kind of progress did you see from the very beginning of the club to when you left in the spring of 1967?
Well, I began to see the club attract better athletes. In the beginning, it was guys that were really passionate about doing something with their high school football careers. They had all this pent-up energy, they liked contact sports, and they went out there to do that. Then we began to beat clubs that didn't expect us to beat them. And it was always a surprise, you know. We'd go up to Harvard or go to Brown or MIT or Manhattan or Columbia or the old Blues and start to beat these guys. I began to see that attract better athletes to the team, more discipline in practices, better coaching, and guys who became committed to really doing something with the club in the name of the university. The other thing that I wanted to do, so I became a match secretary. I learned how to schedule matches and interplay with other people, and I learned some of the tricks of the trade that requires too. And then the club had no money. It was always hand to mouth. The university did not support us because we didn't ask for any varsity status, but insurance was a big problem and injuries were a problem. So we looked for a way to get funding for insurance. We got a student government grant for insurance policies. And then I began to think if we could do some events around campus to raise money, we could get better uniforms, we could schedule an away trip and things like that. Those are the things I began to focus on. And we did. We ended up in my senior year going off to Penn State with 3 teams, buses we'd never chartered before because we'd always used to hop rides and drive beat up cars and kind of do it the right way, so to speak. And so one of the things I'm proud of is kind of leaving that behind, because after I graduated, the club took an away trip to Bermuda, I think, or the Bahamas. And I kind of feel like that helped launch the club in that direction.
You just talked about one of the highlights from your years, that Penn State trip. Any other games or incidents or individuals that absolutely are seared in your memory forever?
Well, there were some real characters on the team, and I was fortunate in the last 2 years, my junior and senior year, to live down on Fairfield Beach with a dear friend who's no longer with us, named John Swanhouse, who was the captain of the team my senior year, who was one of the originals, started in 1963. And that house became famous for rugby parties, and there were other places on the beach like the Sea Ranch that were great places to be. I remember Al Sullivan in 7-a-sides and winning some 7-a-sides tournaments. I remember guys like Bob Corbett, who I hope we can find, because we named the original field after him, because he worked so hard to be a great rugger. We named the field after him, the original field. I remember the annual rugby ball, which was the first big fundraising event we had, and then we had this beat up convertible that we used to raise money by selling sledgehammer shots. This thing, you could drive this car, but the objective was to beat it up so you couldn't drive it anymore. It took us about, I don't know, $150 worth of shots to do that, but you know, I remember things like that.
So it's been a while, but looking back, what has Fairfield Rugby meant to you?
The biggest thing about Fairfield Rugby is the relationships I have with people like yourself, Chris Groward, Tom Crowley, and Betsy Swanhouse, who just walked in the room. That's been a network that has never gone away. And I'm now meeting new rugby players and coaches that I never knew before, but you have an instant bond. And so that's kept me connected to the university and to the club in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I first got started. And it's going to be with me the rest of my life, I have no doubt.
And you're going to be here for the 50th
I am going to be here for the 50th. You convinced me to get on this committee. My wife has said she'll see me next year because, you know, it's consumed my life at the moment. And I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a great event. Great event.
Bart, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.